Did you notice that this show doesn't have any commercials? I'm not selling you diapers or vitamins or smoothies or gasoline. That's because I don't want corporate sponsors telling us what to investigate and what to say. Instead, you're our sponsors. This is a production by our nonprofit, the Informed Consent Action Network. If you want more investigations, more hard-hitting news, if you want the truth, go to ICanDecide.org and donate now. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Wherever you are out there in this crazy world, welcome to The High Wire. You know, when I think about the name of this show, The High Wire, it makes me think about what's really going on here. No other network in the world has been reporting the way we are. Sometimes it feels like we're all alone, dancing on a high wire, high above all the hype and craziness of this circus of mainstream media. We've been moving beyond that hyper-stimulated language and trying to share with you real facts, real numbers from government websites, real data, how modeling's actually working, and more of you, millions across the world, have been tuning in. And for those of you that this is your first time, welcome to The High Wire. Get ready. This is like nothing else you're going to see. Now, just 3 weeks ago, we started by really presenting you the data that came to us from China. We looked into the numbers of China and discussed the death rate there and the fact that we just didn't see a rise in overall death rate that warranted the type of lockdown that we've been seeing. And then, of course, last week, because many people thought we can't trust the numbers from China, we went to Italy and Europe, and we showed you the websites where you can actually see the week-by-week data coming in about the death rates in Europe and specifically Italy. And now, this week, we plan on presenting to you the numbers in America. As you know, we've been told that we're about to hit our peak. We're 2 weeks away from what is expected to be the climax of this entire ordeal here in America. We're going to talk about all the real numbers, the graphs and the thoughts that aren't being shared with you anywhere else. But first, let's look at how the mainstream media covered this week in the news.
America is now the epicenter of the global coronavirus pandemic.
Cases top 70,000 in the 3 states, with over 1,000 deaths. The race to fight the coronavirus in and around New York City reached new heights today.
The majority of cases of coronavirus in America are in the New York metro area.
The Statue of Liberty greeting the USNS Comfort. It will serve as a floating 1,000-bed hospital for non-coronavirus patients, freeing up beds on land.
Anyone coming to Rhode Island in any way from New York must be quarantined.
New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut are now under a 14-day travel advisory.
We have now tested with the best test far more than anybody else. No country is even close.
State police are monitoring our highways, and they will be pulling you over if they see that you have New York plates.
The peak in death rate is likely to hit in 2 weeks. Therefore, we will be extending our guidelines to April 30th.
3.3 million Americans are unsure where their next paycheck is coming from.
An economy that suddenly hit a brick wall.
Dwarfs all historical records in the United States.
Today, the president signing the biggest economic rescue package in history.
Talking about a $6.2 trillion bill.
Going from 50-year low unemployment to a now record 3.2 million Americans seeking unemployment benefits.
Nothing would be worse than declaring victory before the victory is won.
Obviously, it's been a very intense week, and we've been in lockdown for several weeks now. And as you sort of travel to a grocery store, if you happen to be one of those people that has now run out of groceries, you go to stock up, the feeling, the energy is different between those people we're walking amongst and what's going on. It's affecting all of us. And truly, we are all in this together. No matter, what the data says or the decisions being made, most of us don't have any control over any of those things. But to try and really get a better understanding of what's going on, once again, I want to ask us to put all of our political thoughts aside, what parties we represent, and let's remember that we are a family. We're all in this together. whatever happens, we will be here. We will be strong. And today I want to present some of the things that I think could be moving in a positive direction. It's not all bad. There is more and more clarity coming to this discussion. And to bring us more clarity today, I'd like to bring in our own Jeffrey Jackson, who has been covering and looking at the news. Just give me a breakdown of some of the changes. There's been a lot that's really happened in the last 7 days, once again, since we last spoke on Thursday. So, Jeffrey, where are we at? What happened this week?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Del. Well, let's just go right into Johns Hopkins virus tracker. We've been watching that since our first reporting on this, and I actually had to pull new numbers this morning because they changed right before our broadcast here. So the United States is reporting over 226,000 cases, 5,300 deaths roughly. Italy, 115,000 cases, almost 14,000 deaths. Spain, 110,000 cases, a little over 10,000 deaths. Now, taking that and looking at and containment measures, looking at the compulsory or recommended confinements, curfews, quarantines, this equates to basically half the world's population is experiencing some kind of confinement or lockdown strategy. So it's to say this is unprecedented is not even coming close to where we're at as a global society here. Moving into the United States, launching into this week, the Trump administration said that they're going to extend social distancing guidelines until the end of March. So that was a new thing. He still did not say that there will be a federal shutdown, although a lot of people are still prodding him to do that. So this is longer than the initial 15-day timeline that they started out with at the beginning of this for the White House. But the Trump administration did sign finally the $2 trillion stimulus package. That was something that was kind of in the works as we were doing our show last week. It was a bipartisan effort that is signed, basically $1,200 one-time payments to many Americans, sets up a $500 billion corporate liquidity fund, boosts unemployment benefits. But even after it was signed, people were asking, economists were saying, is this going to be enough? Are we going to have to do this in a couple of weeks? And sure enough, today, right before this show, the Labor Department released the jobless claims for last week, and they're stunning. We're looking at 6.6 million last week. The initial jobless claims surged to over 6.6 million. That brings the total to 10 million Americans over the last 2 weeks. And, that's a pretty it's a sad number to report as we're going through all these numbers. They kind of get lost in the mix, but this is something that,
it's a sad number to report, but it's an obvious number, right? I mean, we're all at home. We're in lockdown. People can't work. Small businesses, we knew this was the sacrifice we were going to make, right? This is the sacrifice we've been asked here in America, and other nations have been asked to take on this sacrifice. So this is it. We're looking at the jobless numbers. There's no surprise here. We can't blame anybody for this except, I guess, a virus or the response to the virus. But here we are, 6.6 million jobs and counting. Okay, what else do we have?
Yeah, so, let's go over to the UK. Last week we reported that the Imperial College revised its model. Now that model had kind of baked into the cake a ridiculously wide range of 500,000 deaths for the UK all the way down to less than 20,000. So Neil Ferguson, headlines came out. He was kind of the focus of a lot of headlines bashing him, talking about his backing off his claim, revising his claim. And, I know you're going to break this down a little more in the show, so I'll just leave it there. I will say, though, that doing some research, some of his previous work, his previous models were instrumental in modeling that led to the slaughter of more than 6 million animals during the foot and mouth outbreak in 2001 that left Britain economically devastated. So during that time, basically people are saying, like, look, this is the damage that untrue models can cause. They can cause real harm, real devastation. So I think the lesson here is critical decisions are being made or were made, and with some pretty interesting modeling algorithms, I guess you want to call them, or source code. So now back to the UK again. The UK tests. This is a similar thing that happened when the CDC rolled out its tests in early March. It was reported that those tests saw contamination of unknown causes. Now the UK is reporting that their tests are showing contamination of the coronavirus. when they're
Wow.
trying to roll them out. I mean, I'll just leave that there. It doesn't need any more. It doesn't even any more commentary. But the key primers and probes are contaminated. So that's going to hamper a lot of efforts in the UK. It's going to change. I mean, the ripple effect on that is untold.
Wow. Amazing.
Yeah.
Have we heard any thoughts on chloroquine? We've been discussing that all along with the show. Where are we at with chloroquine, which is the malaria drug that Donald Trump really, we reported weeks ago that Dr. Didier Raoult had really great success with studies looking at chloroquine. We were hearing that international studies were going on. What's happening in America? I know Donald Trump was asking to ramp that up. He wanted the FDA to sort of release it. Where are we at now?
Yeah, so last week, last Monday, France approved the use of chloroquine for severe coronavirus patients. And then just recently, the FDA approved emergency use authorization for hydrochloroquine and chloroquine. So that is a positive step in the right direction, it seems. Definitely, we were ahead out on that reporting. Now, over to New York. Now, this is an interesting story. There is a doctor in New York. He's been across the headlines for the last couple of weeks. It's Dr. Vladimir Zelenko. He's a board-certified practitioner. He first treated 350 coronavirus patients with 100% success using a mixture of hydrochloroquine with a combination of the antibiotic Z-Pak and zinc sulfate. He's updated now. So this most recent update, he's treated 699 COVID-19 patients in New York. 0 patients died, 0 patients intubated, 4 hospitalizations, and the whopping cost for all of this is basically about $20 over the period of 5 days.
And when I watch this, what's a little bit disturbing is something I think you just pointed out there, is the fact that he is saying, I never intubated my patients. I didn't have to. 100% success rate. What that tells me is he's starting the process of using chloroquine earlier. France may be using it in extreme circumstances. The FDA is releasing it for, extreme circumstances. But I would guess, I'm just speculating here, that extreme means you're going onto a ventilator. You're now in a place where you are at death's door. And at that point is the only place we're starting chloroquine. It certainly seems like the success, when we look at the studies done by Didier Raoult and others, is that you really want to start it earlier. Not for everybody. Remember, we have to remember, Jeffrey, right, that, virtually, I think they're saying 90% of us will have either no symptoms or very mild symptoms if we get it. So we're talking about those others that tend to be, I think when you're moving in a direction where it's not going well. My curiosity with this is, are we starting that drug program in time? Are we, if it's just like in an emergency situation, I wouldn't want to wait till I'm about to die to try a malaria drug that's been in circulation for 75 years. I know that Donald Trump's been looking at this. We've reported on the fact that, Fauci says there's trials. So do we have trials going on now in America looking at chloroquine?
Yeah, there's actually trials by the NIH, but even before that, we had trials in March 9th in 2020 by Chinese researchers, and they found that basically the hydrochloroquine was found to inhibit SARS-CoV-2 in vitro. And then the hydrochloroquine basically drives zinc into the cells. So there's a study funded by the NIH as well from 2004 that shows that zinc inhibits respiratory syncytial virus replication in the lungs. So this isn't stuff that is like this brand new cutting edge stuff. This is all known. And to go back to your point, Dr. Zelenko, he reported that the symptoms of the shortness of breath resolved in 4 to 6 hours after treatment. So this is something that is not, it's a pretty quick turnaround.
And we're seeing this spike, right? We're talking about this spike. I think what's somewhat disturbing, look, people that have been with the Highwire for the last several years know that I'm all about safety testing. That's one of the biggest issues. We have a legal team that is suing on different types of products and vaccines that haven't been through proper safety studies. I'm really into safety studies, but we are talking about a product that has been proven safe for 75 years. Now, let's not beat around the bush. There are, side effects. One of the major ones being, there's some hallucinations and things that can come from. My understanding is about 25% of the patients, I think it wears off. So you have to imagine if you're sick, But this is something that when I went to Haiti, they gave a bottle of this to every one of us that were going to go and deal with the earthquake in Haiti when I was working on the Doctor's television show. And basically, you were allowed to pop this like candy. So we obviously don't think it's so dangerous. So I just think about all the times we rush through. We're rushing on a vaccine right now. We're rushing to, test all these other things. But right now, if the next 2 weeks is the critical point, are we really waiting to do studies to have the chloroquine move into a space that's less about just if you're about to die, and really, if you really are showing strong symptoms, shortness of breath, wouldn't it be smart, since this is the 2 weeks that are going to matter, to really bring chloroquine in? I mean, this isn't even a part of the show today, but I just wanted to jump on it because there's so much to get to. But it just kind of defies reason, doesn't it? We've never seen people dropping dead from chloroquine. It's something we use all the time for people that travel to third world nations. We know that we had success using it during SARS, which was a coronavirus. Why would we be just so gentle right now? It really begs the question as we're staring at the face of 100 to 200,000 deaths now. Why aren't we just saying, you know what do you have to lose? I think even Donald Trump said that. What do you have to lose? What do we have to lose, Jeffrey?
In my opinion, nothing. It seems counterproductive not to do it. I mean, with what's at stake here, and we don't have to go through it. We just went through it in this news headlines. We know what's at stake. There's so much. This is things for a couple dollars. These doctors can prescribe this. We don't have to wait. They can prescribe it with zinc, and off it goes. I mean, what's the negative? What's the negative components to this? I can't see if you have a plus and minus column. I see a lot of pluses and not many minuses here. So my question, or my answer to that, is the same thing to your question, is what do we have to lose, really? I
mean, when they're saying we could hit 200,000 deaths, rightfully so, they're not including chloroquine as being able to lower that. They're saying if we do anything but chloroquine. But that could really, if you're looking at Zelenko saying 699 cases, 100% success rate, I sure would love to see the medical establishment change its route here. I'd like to see hospitals around the country, personally, if there's just not a really strong downside, it just seems like we could swing this. And by the way, as we're watching 6 million people being laid off and counting and going that direction, it stands to reason we could avoid a lockdown or get out of this lockdown if you could take care. I mean, right, we're all here. We're all in lockdown. The healthy people are in lockdown. All of us could walk out tomorrow and get this. It'll be just like a cold for everyone that's healthy, which is what we've been told from the data all around the world. We've only been worried about those that have pre-existing conditions and are going to get really sick. If you had a cure for them, then we're out of lockdown. But that's not where this is going. There are people calling for even more dramatic lockdown, are there not?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'll touch on this really quick. We have Bill Gates. He stepped down a couple of weeks ago from Microsoft and Berkshire Hathaway board of directors. That was really unprecedented. And he's launched himself full speed ahead into this virus response and kind of like a crystal ball prediction man. So he's talking about, in a Reddit AMA recently, he's talking about, quote, digital certificates will be used to identify who received the upcoming COVID-19 vaccine. They'll also be used to identify who can conduct businesses, travel, and then Gates was also out front. This is just recently. This is, I believe, yesterday was the headline calling for the United States lockdown. So we have Bill Gates suggesting the United States stays locked down for 6 weeks. It's calling for a nationwide social isolation policy, either by all governors or at the federal level. So he's going in pretty hard. And I don't have to tell the viewers that obviously he's associated with vaccination and vaccination development here. So pretty interesting to keep an eye on.
He has skin in the game.
Yeah,
I mean, he definitely has skin in the game. He's got funding in major pharmaceutical companies, which are really behind a lot of this modeling, what's going on. There's a lot of questions I think that people are starting to have. But the idea of, digital, we're hearing, discussions of microchipping people to see if they've had the illness and are immune, or if they've had their vaccines. I mean, a lot of this. And I think as we're locked down, more and more people are starting to feel like we're in the middle of some sort of science fiction movie. And the idea, is that where we're going to go? Well, we're going to see lockdowns more in our future. Our children are going to get used to, during flu seasons, we lock down, we let our jobs disappear. We're going to get microchipped to get out of it. So many questions. Jeffrey, thank you for bringing all that information to us. Obviously, I know you're going to keep focused. I'm sure the next 2 weeks, we're going to see what happens. We're moving towards the peak. It's very interesting.
Absolutely, Dale. Thank you so much. Important times.
Take care. Well, you know, as we watch these headlines, and we watch, you know, people like Bill Gates, and he's not alone, people calling for more draconian measures. We really have to lock people down. We're talking about cars being pulled over. You know, New Yorkers can't go into Rhode Island. If you have a New York license plate, you're going to be pulled over. Houses being visited to see who's inside. Are we social distancing? All of these things, you know, really are very, very dramatic. And for a lot of us, it's causing a lot of stress. And I think behind it is the fact that, you know, we are really questioning, is this where we're supposed to be? Is this necessary? I mean, we trust our doctors, right? We trust the medical establishment. We trust our news agencies are reporting this fairly, and we really are in the middle of a crisis. And I think I'm hearing a lot of people starting to really ask themselves, can I trust them? I mean, have we ever known them to be wrong before? Which really got me thinking this week. You know, there has been similar events to this, very similar, in fact. And I believe that the last time we had this type of dramatic rhetoric, they actually had it dead wrong. It sounded extremely familiar to what we just heard last week. This was just a few years ago.
The latest on the swine flu epidemic, which the CDC said today has spread widely and cannot be contained.
We do not think we can contain the spread of this virus.
The global threat level is now at its highest ever.
President Obama decided to declare the epidemic a national emergency of swine flu.
Medical workers in biohazard suits and people wearing surgical masks out on the streets.
Public events have been canceled and children are being turned away from their classrooms as schools nationwide have been shut down until May 6th.
Staff aren't taking any risks. And elsewhere, authorities are doing whatever they can to reduce the chance of more infection.
The Centers for Disease Control this past week quadrupled its estimated H1N1 flu virus death toll to roughly 3,900.
46 states are reporting H1N1 as widespread, with more than 1,000 deaths and 20,000 hospitalizations. And while an average case is usually no more dangerous than other flu, this strain has its unknowns. 30% of the deaths are in healthy people with no underlying problems.
We don't know how good or bad this situation is because we don't actually know how many people are infected.
Government officials struggling to cope with the outbreak have launched a massive public health campaign to get people to wear masks and wash their hands.
Even if it turns out that the H1N1 is relatively mild on the front end, it could come back in a more virulent form during the actual flu season.
Around the country, tens of thousands lined up for swine flu vaccines, hoping to get a shot before being shut out.
But there are only 11 million doses available, far short of the 40 million expected by this time, and the 150 million the government says will eventually be needed for everyone.
We don't know what the future will bring in terms of H1N1 cases.
The earlier we get the vaccines, the better.
Absolutely.
Crazy, isn't it? It's almost like the same script was borrowed. The movie didn't do well the first time, let's make a sequel, and here we are. I don't want to undermine what's happening here. We have been sticking to the numbers. I'm not going to project into things, but the similarity is striking. Only that time, they got it dead wrong. And many of us have forgotten that and that's what I want to remind you of. Remember the headlines that came out after the H1N1 pandemic crisis. Daily Mail said, the false pandemic. Drug firms cashed in on scare over swine flu, claims Euro health chief. The health chief said the drug firms were the ones that had driven this. And then Boston.com had this to say. 2 medical reports accused WHO of exaggerating H1N1 threat. They went after the WHO that was behind it. Very much the WHO is a part of this pandemic scare we have right now. And then, of course, CBS News, Cheryl Atkinson was a top reporter who did a giant investigation into this. This was her article, Swine Flu Cases Overestimated, ? And it went on to say, if you've been diagnosed, probable, or presumed 2009 H1N1 or swine flu positive in recent months, you may be surprised to know this. Odds are you didn't have H1N1 flu. In fact, you probably didn't have flu at all. That's according to state-by-state test results obtained in a 3-month-long CBS News investigation. In late July, the CDC abruptly advised states to stop testing for H1N1 flu and stop counting individual cases. The rationale given for the CDC guidance to forego testing and tracking individual cases was, why waste resources testing for H1N1 flu when the government has already confirmed there's an epidemic? And so they had testing issues, and they were avoiding it. And she put out some very interesting graphs because they did look into testing. And look what they discovered in the different states like Florida, that, you know, negative for other flus. 83%, only 17% ended up having the H1N1 flu when they really looked at the studies. In California, only 2% ended up having H1N1 flu. And there was 12% that had others. Then the other 86% were having symptoms from something else. There's way too much assumption that had gone on. You look at Alaska, 1% H1N1. Georgia, 2%. This was a devastating report looking at the medical establishment. And really, you had to also fault mainstream media for how hard it had pushed this issue. And then there was a brilliant article that came out in the BMJ. Let's take a look at this. In the BMJ, this was written: the world should, of course, be thankful that the 2009 influenza A H1N1 pandemic proved such a damp squib, with so many fewer lives lost than had been predicted. It almost seems ungrateful to carp about the cost. But carp we must, because the cost has been huge. Some countries, notably Poland, declined to join the panic buying of vaccines and antivirals triggered when the World Health Organization declared the pandemic a year ago this week. However, countries like France and the United Kingdom, who have stockpiled drugs and vaccines, are now busy unpicking vaccine contracts, selling unused vaccine to other countries, and sitting on huge piles of unused oseltamivir. Meanwhile, drug companies have banked vast profits, $7 billion, $10 billion from vaccines alone, according to investment bank J.P. Morgan. Given the scale of public costs and private profit, it would seem important to know that WHO's key decisions were free from commercial influence. The article goes on to show all the people that had been behind these decisions that weren't free from corporate interest, but in fact stood to make money or worked for drug makers and things like that. Now, is this happening again? We don't know. But I will tell you, I have had people close to me, others reach out and say, Del, you're in dangerous territory. You better be careful about challenging the numbers, challenging Tony Fauci. And, you know, and that made us really, really adamant. I was adamant with my team that we get this right. I told you last week, we don't want to mess up on the numbers. But I'm telling you right here on the high wire, we do walk a high wire. We are not afraid to bring you the truth. And we have looked everywhere we can for the truth. We want to get this right. We don't want to sensationalize. I don't want to undermine, you know, data that could end up showing that this illness is really deadly. But we also, I want you to wear the hat now and imagine we have gotten this wrong before. The same exact players were dead wrong before. And if they're wrong this time, it will be a lot more than buying way too many vaccines and making drug makers billions and billions of dollars. Now we are losing jobs, not just in this country, but around the world. Our livelihood, our futures are at stake. Our 401ks are at stake. Everything, the way we're going to raise our kids, are they going to be able to ever hug in the future? All of these things are hanging in the balance. Is it possible we got it wrong? Is it possible that the media might be pushing it too far? In fact, when we looked at it, and a lot of people started looking this week, it seemed that mainstream media in many ways went beyond even pushing too far. In some ways, they made it really easy for Donald Trump to use one of his favorite slogans and call mainstream media fake news. Here's a couple of the instances that I think are really, really scary and dangerous and make me embarrassed to say that these people are journalists. Here's one of the instances that we ended up seeing that was called out. This was a New York Times article. It said the other option is death. New York starts sharing of ventilators. To keep coronavirus patients breathing, hospitals are pioneering a little-tested method. This is the New York Times. They are making people believe right now that we're sharing ventilators. Well, when we looked into the article, you see the pictures, you see the discussions. It goes on to say, a New York hospital system has begun treating 2 patients instead of 1 on some ventilators, a desperate measure that could help alleviate a shortage of the critical breathing machines and help hospitals around the country respond to the surge of coronavirus patients expected in the coming weeks. Inside of the article was a tweet that somebody put out of a photo of two patients sharing one of these respirators. And it said, "This is what we are down to, splitting ventilators and facing serious dilemmas like choosing who will be actually ventilated when everybody should. Bloody, seriously, never thought it was so bad." It goes on to create this terror that we're basically making life-to-death decisions. We don't have room to put some people on the ventilators. We're having to split them up. And remember, this is off-label usage. It got so bad that even Deborah Birx, who's one of the people in the head of the task force on this whole issue for Donald Trump, had to call out the news and say, "Please stop it. You're scaring people." Take a look.
We were reassured and meeting with our colleagues in New York that there are still ICU beds remaining, and there's still significant over 1,000 or 2,000 ventilators that have not been utilized yet. Please, for the reassurance of people around the world, to wake up this morning and look at people talking about creating DNR situations, do not resuscitate situations for patients. There is no situation in the United States right now that warrants that kind of discussion. You can be thinking about it in a hospital. Certainly many hospitals talk about this on a daily basis. But to say that to the American people, to make the implication that when they need a hospital bed, it's not going to be there, or when they need that ventilator, it's not going to be there. We don't have an evidence of that right now. And it's our job collectively to assure the American people that it's our collective job to make sure that doesn't happen.
What is she talking about? Is she lying? What do you mean? We have evidence. We saw pictures of ventilators being shared. The New York Times reported on it, Deborah. Except here's the problem. You had to read practically till the end of that article by the New York Times to see this paragraph. The hospital has not yet run out of ventilators, but Dr. Baitler said it was better to try the technique now than when you have absolutely no choice. Is that a bit of misreporting? I mean, when we think about the false news that's being slammed on things that the high wire has provided for you, to say the other option is death, is the other option death? Or is the other option one of the ventilators that's sitting across the room unused right now, which happens to be the case? You see, this was a publicity stunt. They put together the fact that you could divide it. It's something we could do in the future, but the New York Times represented it as fact. We had another situation with CBS News. Here was the report we saw coming out of New York.
New York's governor says FEMA gave the state 400 ventilators. To that, he said this.
What am I going to do with 400 ventilators when I need 30,000?
Now, Andrew Cuomo may think he needs 30,000, but the idea is that we're running out of beds, like Deborah Birx said. We're looking at videos. We're running out of ventilators. Look, that entire room is packed. People are really sick. Except that while we were talking about New York and we were looking at what we thought was an ER in New York packed with people and a shortage of ventilators, look, what was actually reported was that that wasn't New York. In fact, that was a totally different country. Look at this.
The sheer numbers of people succumbing to the coronavirus is overwhelming every hospital in northern Italy.
Apparently CBS stole footage that had taken place in Italy, a place that ultimately has already described itself as having a terrible hospital system, that it is incapable of handling this issue. That's the same room. It's unbelievable. The same people. A CBS News channel tried to make you afraid of the epidemic that was crashing upon New York by showing you something happening in a country with far less resources. This was outrageous, and it was so bad that CBS ended up having to apologize. Here's what they said. CBS News admits mistake after airing footage of overcrowded Italian hospital in report about NYC. Let me be clear about this. Many of you know I was a producer on the daytime talk show The Doctors. For who? CBS. In fact, two other of the producers here. My executive producer and one of our field producers also came from the CBS Talks to the Doctors. We work together. I know how you choose your footage. And by the way, footage does not just suddenly appear in your editing system from Italy and no one knows it's from Italy. It's marked Italian footage, you know, crisis in Italy. It's going to have that type of moniker on it. Somebody purposefully took it and put it in a piece about New York. Maybe the editor did it, but then you had the producer producing the piece and the field producer that was also producing the piece. And then they had to go through their supervisor producer that looked at it. And then it went to the executive producer and then ultimately the director of the show. What I'm telling you is this is not a mistake by one person. This doesn't happen. There are stopgaps to make sure you don't make mistakes like this. Somebody at CBS thought they could slide this past the people, because I guarantee you at least 7 to 10 different people on that show got to make a decision whether they ran with that or not. Let's move on, as if, you know, I wish that was the only case. But perhaps one of the most egregious cases at a time where news networks keep saying, we're in this together, we got to make this sacrifice together, it appears that some people want to tear us apart and want to accuse others of things going on. I would hope when you do that, you at least get it right. Take a look at this.
In terms of the happy talk we've had on this front from the federal government, there is no sign that the Navy hospital ships that the president made such a big deal of, the Comfort and the Mercy, there's no sign that they'll be anywhere on site helping out anywhere in the country for weeks yet. The president said when he announced that those ships would be put into action against the COVID-19 epidemic, he said one of those ships would be operational in New York Harbor by next week. That's nonsense. It will not be there next week.
Really, Rachel? Where did that report come from? How'd you know that? Because guess what happened just 1 week later?
In a few moments, the crew of the Navy hospital ship USNS Comfort, which is really something, will embark for New York City, where they will join the ranks of tens of thousands of amazing doctors, nurses, and medical professionals who are battling to save American lives.
The Statue of Liberty greeting the USNS Comfort as waiting crowds failed to social distance.
I mean, I don't know what you do with that, Rachel. I don't know how you move forward. And by the way, I don't know how people keep tuning in if you're going to be that dramatic about something, saying it's absolutely preposterous that the president's going to deliver. And I think at one point she even said those ships are in dry dock. There's no way they can even get into the water. And yet there it was, pulling up in the harbor as was promised. You see, this type of reporting, it's dangerous. It's dangerous because we lose credibility with the people. And if we're supposed to live in a free country that has free media. But I've told you before, this is media being funded by the pharmaceutical industry. Clearly, there's an agenda. And if you're watching the commercials between every one of those false reports that we just pointed out, you will see pharma ads for drugs. That's a really big problem, and I think more and more people are waking up, and less people are trusting mainstream news. It got to be such a major issue last week that a hashtag may actually reveal something that we would have never seen. The hashtag was #FilmYourHospitals. Citizen journalists took to the streets because they just didn't buy the sensationalism anymore. Here were the videos we all started seeing appear all over the internet.
Elmhurst Hospital, the center of the coronavirus outbreak, and it looks like a ghost town. And look at that. Nobody.
This is James Street Hospital. It's like a ghost town in the hospital.
I've been here for an hour. Not one person has walked up to the tents. Not one.
Hey man, is it true? Is it pretty swamped inside there? There ain't no testing. Tents, that's the emergency entrance to Grady Hospital right there.
And it's empty. A little odd, don't you think?
Oh my God, admissions. Totally empty. Look at this. Totally empty. This is admissions. The big panic of admissions on. Look.
Look at more people are taking videos because no one's believing the fake media. You see all the ambulances that are on the block down there? They're all parked. They've been there for an hour.
Respiratory lab. Look at this. Oh my God. Just crazy. Absolutely.
This is what you saw on the news. Where's the line for the tent? Nobody's here on the tent. Look at all these parked ambulances just for show. The news cameras. None of them are in action.
You would actually think there was a war going on, seriously. This is crazy, crazy, crazy stuff.
Now, let me be perfectly clear. We did not take time to verify whether that footage was shot at this time of year or at some other point. All I'm showing you is that there are people posting these videos, whether or not they're real, whether those are really empty hospitals. I'm not attempting to say that there are no ERs that aren't busy right now. I'm sure there are. But it really points out one of the problems you have when you lock down a population and you take them out of work. There's a lot of people that are getting stir-crazy right now with a lot of time on their hands. They're deciding, you know what, I'm going to go out and check this out myself. We'll continue to look into that and see if that is actually the reality. We have definitely seen articles that show that hospitals that, maybe had a big PR event like Elmhurst Hospital, now there's articles saying actually the numbers are down the very next day or they're lower, not as many patients coming in. So it's getting really hard to tell what's going on. But what we do know is we've caught mainstream media putting out false information, fake information, fudging images, stealing images, all while other things are going on. While the high wire last week, what we were doing was trying to bring you the truth, trying to bring you numbers, not sensationalize it, not talk about, things we couldn't prove. We've been showing you the actual numbers. And to back up those numbers, I showed you about 11 other international scientists like these guys right here that all around the world have been speaking out, in fact, shouting from mountaintops, saying we are studying the numbers ourselves. Virologists, mathematicians, Peter Gutcha in there, Didier Raoult, major historical figures in medicine, putting their names on the line to say, we don't see the numbers. This appears to be just like any other coronavirus that happens every other year or any other flu. And in the middle of our report last week, one of the biggest stories I think that has broken the entire time, I think it's the biggest story, was the fact that the imperial model, which was being called out by all of the scientists you just saw, saying, we don't trust this model. We haven't seen the code. It doesn't make sense. It's not coming true. It does not look like it's adding up with the actual factual data that we were looking at. And at that moment, during our broadcast last week, on Thursday, the story broke that Neil Ferguson, who was the one who pioneered and wrote the imperial model that the world had followed, that had said that it was going to be 500,000 deaths, actually dropped it down to 20,000 deaths. A gigantic collapse in numbers in this model. And when we looked out, I told you at the show last week, go watch CNN tonight. CNN was about to have, a roundtable discussion with Anderson Cooper and Sanjay Gupta, and, we would have Fauci in there. Well, this production was unbelievable. I'm sorry I even sent you because one of the most boring shows I've ever watched. Even though it was advertised like Anderson Cooper standing in the middle of this room with all these beautiful televisions around him, and it ended up being like a Zoom call 3 wide. At one point, we're talking to Fauci. Next, we have the most dramatic and pinnacle of the show was when Sanjay Gupta showed us how to wash our hands, and then we finished off with an epically long discussion with a man who sells computers telling us why we should be worried about coronavirus. It was really crazy, but in that entire, literally that day, the imperial model had just crashed. It had gone from, 500,000 suspected deaths in the UK down to 20,000. No one mentioned it. It wasn't mentioned in the fact or fiction story in the roundtable being done by CNN. We didn't see it in any of the news agencies we were looking at. All we saw was what took place during the podium speech, and Deborah Birx had to cover it. This is what she had to say. And remember, did you see this in the news?
I'm sure many of you saw the recent report out of the UK about them adjusting completely their needs. This is really quite important. If you remember, that was the report that said there would be 500,000 deaths in the UK and 2.2 million deaths in the United States. They've adjusted that number in the UK to 20,000. So 500,000 to 20,000. We're looking into this in great detail to understand that adjustment. I'm going to say something that's a little bit complicated, but I'm going to try to do it in a way that we can all understand it together. In the model, either you have to have a large group of people who are asymptomatic, who've never presented for any test, in order to have the kind of numbers that were predicted. To get to 60 million people infected, or 6 million people infected, you have to have a large group of asymptomatics, because in no country to date have we seen an attack rate over 1 in 1,000. So either we're only measuring the tip of the iceberg of the symptomatic cases, and underneath it are a large group of people. So we're working very hard to get that antibody test, because that's a good way to figure out who are all these people under here and do they exist. Or we have the transmission completely wrong. So these are the things we're looking at, because the predictions of the models don't match the reality on the ground in either China, South Korea, or Italy. We are about 5 times the size of Italy. So if we were Italy and you did all those divisions, Italy should have close to 400,000 deaths. They're not close to achieving that.
The predictions don't match the models, is what she said. Actually, if you'd watched the models we've been presenting for the last 3 or 4 weeks now on the subject, it really is matching our models. This is exactly what we've been reporting on the high wire when no one else was. And so after we got off the stage, we got to figure out what happened with Neil Ferguson. How did this happen? I mean, you can imagine more and more of you are watching our show. You were starting to question, does this model make any sense? We showed you 11 top scientists amongst dozens or maybe even more around the world that are stepping forward and saying, we do not trust this imperial model. And that's exactly what was going on. When we look back, there was a Twitter storm that had begun just earlier in the week, right around the 22nd. You see, Neil Ferguson, who had come up with the imperial model, was under attack by many different scientists and thought leaders in the world saying, you know, where is your code? What's going on? We should, now, take that off for a second. Let me just talk to the people here for a second. I want to explain something, because I called a bunch of my friends around the world that deal in, scientific modeling. And it really is a standard practice now that if you're going to do a model that affects global health in any way that affects other people, you're supposed to immediately present your code, meaning the background, all of the numbers that you came to your conclusion, helped you come to that conclusion, so that it could be peer-reviewed. This imperial model that obviously Deborah Birx is talking about it because we followed it. It's really important to us. She didn't say it didn't matter because America never looked at that model anyway. She said this is a real concern. It's making us look at our numbers. We all have to rethink this because Italy came nowhere near the death rate that that model was predicting. And so scientists around the world were saying, you know, Neil, you're supposed to give us your code, and we're really having a problem with it, especially when the death numbers all around the world are not making any sense. They're not coming anywhere close to your modeling. Why didn't you have it peer-reviewed? Why aren't you providing your code? This is one of the responses. This is sort of how he responded to it. He said this: I'm conscious that lots of people would like to see and run the pandemic simulation code we are using to model control measures against COVID-19. To explain the background, I wrote the code, thousands of lines of undocumented code, 13+ years ago to model flu pandemics. This was a 13-year-old model for flu he was using. Look at the statement right after it. 1 out of 19, it is disappointing that critical, this is one of the statements this person must have made. It is disappointing that critical decisions relating to the COVID-19 crisis in public health and the economy rely on scientific software containing thousands of lines of undocumented code, source code, which has never been publicly accessible. Where's the thread? Well, let's get this out there. This person goes on to say, Why haven't you just immediately released the code and allowed global community dissect it and work on it? Now is not the time to be embarrassed about some code. You're missing the power of open source to accomplish feats, especially when people are highly motivated. Everyone's demanding, show us the code. We've got great scientists around the world. How does he respond? He basically, in some British sort of way, says, piss off. This is what he ends up saying. I am happy to say that at Microsoft and at GitHub are working with at Imperial, JIDEA, and MRC Outbreak to document, refactor, and extend the code to allow others to use without the multiple days training it would currently require, and which we don't have time to give. Basically, I'm not going to give it to you now. I'm going to call you all a bunch of idiots because I would have to explain it, and somebody else is working on that. We've got Microsoft on it. Oh, really? So we've got Bill Gates, the guy that's telling everybody to lock down, the guy that has tons of money in pharmaceutical companies all around the world, is developing a vaccine as we speak. We're using him as the only person to look at this code? I mean, that really doesn't make sense. I think this last point in the tweets really hits it best. The probability, this is the bottom line, the probability that thousands of lines of C code, not peer-reviewed, non-documentation, no tests, is without errors is zero. The probability is zero that there are not mistakes in that. Well, guess what happened? After all of this pressure, we ended up seeing the breaking news story. We didn't cover it here, at least I didn't see it. Maybe you did. We know Deborah Birx talked about it. But did you see it on Fox? Did they really dig down in Neil Ferguson? This is the Washington Examiner. Imperial College scientist who predicted 500,000 coronavirus deaths in UK adjusts figure to 20,000 or fewer. This is Daily Wire. Epidemiologist behind highly cited coronavirus model drastically downgrades projection. By the way, I want to point out that headline. Can we look at that headline really quick because this is important? We had a headline that was different than this when we broke the news story. The original headline had said that it was wrong and the code was wrong, and a lot of people accused us of over-sensationalizing, saying the Imperial Code was wrong. This headline was changed by Daily Wire after we had presented it. So let me be clear. The Daily Wire changed its headline. At one point it was saying that the code was wrong. Now they're just saying it drastically changed it, just to be clear. So let me clear that up. We're a weekly show. Let me clear up. If there's any misunderstanding, it wasn't wrong. It was just drastically changed. In fact, if you really look at the drop from 500,000 projected deaths in the UK down to 20,000 deaths, 20,000 to 500,000 means they missed it by approximately 2,000, 400%? Did we do the math? 2,400% is how far off this modeling was. And here from the Daily Mail, obviously irate is this article. There's powerful evidence this great panic is foolish, yet our freedom is still broken and our economy crippled. Professor Neil Ferguson was one of those largely responsible for the original panic, claiming 500,000 people could die. He or others from Imperial College have twice revised this terrifying prophecy, first to fewer than 20,000, and then on Friday to 5,700. You know, we told you to go ahead and watch this on CNN, as I said. We know what was taking place there, but no one decided to cover that. I think, to me personally, I mean, you can decide, and it's up to you to decide, do you think that was one of the biggest stories in the world when it comes to coronavirus? I do. I think it's really important that we have seen this number drop down. And it really makes us wonder, how is it affecting everything else? Well, the numbers have now changed. In America, we've reduced our numbers. Where there was a fear we would be at 2.2 million, Deborah Birx is now discussing it a different way. It sounds like this.
So in the flu models, the worst case scenario is between 1.6 million and 2.2 million deaths. That's the projection if you do nothing. So we've never really done all of these things that we're doing. We've put them into a model. We've looked at the Italy data with their self-isolation, and that's where we come up with, if we do things together well, almost perfectly, we could get in the range of 100,000 to 200,000 fatalities.
Okay. So there we see our numbers are changing from 100,000 to 200,000. So I want to talk about Italy because we discussed this last week. You know it. I'm getting to America's numbers. But remember, what Deborah Birx is saying is we were looking at Italy. We were looking at these models, and now we're downgrading these models. She said in the video two back that we're a lot like Italy. We've been following Italy, but those numbers just didn't add up. Well, we introduced you to Euromomo, which is a website. And by the way, let me just stop really quickly because so many of you are brand new. If you want the information we're providing here, I'm not just running things by you in headlines you'll never be able to fact check yourself. All you have to do right now if you're on Facebook is type in ICAN into your comments, and we will deliver you through messaging as much of the information that we have that we can fit into the bot there. If you're watching on YouTube, which is growing exponentially, and thank you for your viewership, or on our website, thehighwire.com, you can text us. Just text 33222, and we will present the information that we are providing here so you can fact check it and look at the links where it's coming from. The High Wire is all about being transparent with you. I am not trying to tell you what to think. I am trying to show you how we are thinking about it, where we are looking, and the information that we are finding. And many of you were really excited about Euromomo last week. Now, let me be clear. We can't fit everything we do on the show, especially with the data we're piling into, onto that ICAN. So for those of you that really want every single detail that we cover every single week, the best way to do that is become a recurring donor to the High Wire. We're asking people to donate $20 for 2020, but whether you give us $1 a month or $20 a month or $1,000 a month, you will get a weekly breakdown, a newsletter that has every single link categorized so you can understand it, so you can do your own research. That's what we're all about. Like I've said before, we are not funded by pharma or anyone else. We're funded by you. This helps us get you the information. We've hired now researchers. We've got medical investigative researchers around the world. So we're expanding because of your help. Now, some of that help has brought us websites we would have never found. That was Euromomo. Now, last week I reported to you that we were looking at the numbers, that every single week in Europe, Euromomo calculates whether or not we're on an average line of infection or death, essentially. It's the excess death monitoring system. And we showed you that there had been an uptick last week in Italy. But around the rest of Europe, there really was nothing going on. And we discussed whether or not this uptick was worthy of quarantining the world. Well, you can check Euromomo out. Many of you did. We got brand new numbers today. So before we get into America, I think it's important to understand what's going on in Italy. And again, I've got nothing to hide. I don't have an agenda here. I want you to see how this works. This is where the data is actually coming. Let's just see on the back wall here where we're at today in the weekly death rate, excess death rate in Europe. Okay. Now, it's a very low-res document, and hopefully you can see this, but it just came out literally within the hour. We just got it, so I'm going to do my best to sort of walk you through it. But again, what you're looking at is a week-by-week breakdown of the deaths that are occurring. Now, this red line in the middle of all of these graphs here, the red line is the average throughout the year. Now, there's times it goes above the line and times it goes below the line, but these are the averages that we're looking at. And so if you focus in, Italy is right here. And last week we showed you it had upticked. Now last week we were above this first line, which is exemplified by a 4, and then there's the 8 line. We were above the 4 line and just below the 8. Well, it has gone up, folks. In the middle of the crisis in Italy, it has now gone above this line just a little bit. I hope you can see that. That is taking place. In fact, we also have an uptick in a couple of other areas. That's Spain, where we're having a big issue. Spain has now hit the top line. Those are really two of the big places where this is taking place. Other countries are down, but we are up. And I want to point out that that is the case. However, the question is, how dramatic is it? Now, I want to point out that the headlines right now, or at least one of the headlines we're seeing coming out of Italy, is saying that it looks like we've hit the peak in Italy, and we're now on our way down. So we should be seeing what is approximately the peak. We may have one more week because there's some delay, but there you go. The Wall Street Journal saying Italy hopeful that the coronavirus pandemic is slowing down. Why this is important to us is this is what we're following. We're watching Italy's spike right now, and we believe we're 2 weeks behind Italy here in the United States of America, which is why Donald Trump and everybody is saying the spike is coming. The next 2 weeks is going to be everything. Well, this is the spike we're looking at in Italy. But I want to point this out as I did last week. If you follow this spike, sure, it's fairly dramatic. But if you go back through the years, we had a spike here, a little bit lower than this year. But then look at this spike. This one hit the top line. I believe this is right around 2018. And then if you go back to 2017, clearly this spike right here went way above the line, somewhere about where we're at. We didn't lock down then. And if you really look at all the nations in Europe, look at this. Whatever, I'm assuming this was some sort of flu outbreak all over Europe. And what we see is there was a giant spike all the way across Europe. And so it really puts into perspective what's happening. Remember, this is the crisis point that has us all terrified. There it is, a little bit clearer for you. It is above the line, but then if you look at 2017, it's right on par with there. Now, if we're watching this is starting to flatten out in Italy, maybe it goes up a little bit higher. But again, the question we've been asking here on the High Wire is, does it warrant the type of, absolute lockdown, destruction of economies and society if in the worst epidemic area, we covered China, we just didn't see it. We covered Italy. I don't think most people looking at that would say that doesn't look worse than 2017. We didn't lock down in 2017. And I remember, I think back to Donald Trump saying things like that, just a few weeks ago, saying, we've had flus before and we never locked it down before, but here we are. Here we are. There's a recalibration taking place. And as Deborah Burke said, no matter how dramatic that number looks like, it is nowhere near what we had expected. It is nowhere near. And we presented all the scientists telling you, we do believe that these draconian measures are dangerous and that we are going to hurt our society in ways, and we should stop it immediately if the numbers are not correct. In fact, this is becoming such an issue that even in Germany, one of the top scientists reached out to Angela Merkel, and this is what he was complaining about. Look at this article. It's an open letter just written last week. Remember, one of the top scientists is Dr. Shukaret Bhakti, MD. He's a microbiologist, former professor at Johannes Gutenberg University in Mainz, former head of the Institute for Medical Microbiology and Hygiene, one of the most cited research scientists in German history. Look what he went on to say. Open letter from Professor Shukaret Bhakti to German Chancellor Dr. Angela Merkel. He says, the internationally recognized International Journal of Antimicrobial Agents will soon publish a paper that addresses exactly this question. Preliminary results of the study can already be seen today and lead to the conclusion that the new virus is not different from traditional coronaviruses in terms of dangerousness. The authors expressed this in the title of their paper, SARS-CoV-2, Fear versus Data. He goes on to say, at the same time, the mistake is being made worldwide to report virus-related deaths as soon as it is established that the virus was present at the time of death, regardless of other factors. This violates a basic principle of infectiology. I think this is a translation from German. There's probably a better word for that. Only when it is certain that an agent has played a significant role in the disease or death may a diagnosis be made. And lastly, look at this, his question. Has Germany simply followed this trend of a COVID-19 general suspicion? And is it intended to continue this categorization uncritically as in other countries? How then is a distinction to be made between genuine corona-related deaths and accidental virus presence at the time of death? See, this is the point. We know when we were looking at Italy that the articles came out that 99% of the numbers we're seeing, that death rate that we're watching spike right there on Euromomo, are attributed to people who have comorbid issues. They were dying of other issues. And when they combed through that information, what they ended up discovering was that 88% of the death cases ended up dying for reasons other than coronavirus. Here it was, on reevaluation by the National Institute of Health, only 12% of death certificates have shown a direct causality from coronavirus, while 88% of patients who have died have at least one pre-morbidity. You see, they ended up looking at the numbers and saying it's really only 12% of the number we're seeing. So if we're seeing 14,000 or wherever they're at, you really have to just take 12% of that and say this is most likely the actual coronavirus number. Now, if you think I'm exaggerating this, or I'm, cherry-picking scientists like Bhakti that prove a point, did you know that even Fauci is coming to this conclusion? That's right. Now, again, did you see this in mainstream news? Because the very same day that Neil Ferguson was downgrading and was admitting that at 20,000 we were, 2,400% off of where we'd be, I guess that Fauci probably knew about it. I imagine he probably got a call. I'm speculating here. There's going to be some bad numbers coming out. Neil must have warned people, if you've been following my model, I'm going to make a serious downgrade. I'm going to guess that's what's happened because Fauci wrote an article that came out that same day. This is, what is it, in the New England Journal of Medicine? That's right. The New England Journal of Medicine, this is your own Anthony Fauci, along with Clifford Lane, MD, and Robert Redfield from the CDC. COVID-19, navigating the uncharted. Look at this statement inside of this article. If one assumes that the number of asymptomatic or minimally symptomatic cases is several times as high as the number of reported cases, the case fatality rate may be considerably less than 1%. What? Less than 1%? He goes on to say, this suggests that the overall clinical consequences of COVID-19 may ultimately be more akin to those of a severe seasonal influenza, which has a case fatality rate of approximately 0.1%. Remember, Del Bigtree is not telling you this. I am not telling you this. I am not trying to go out of my way. The head of the decision makers here in America, the lead doctor we have, is writing this in an article that came out last week. Again, did you see this on your news channel? Let's get back to that paragraph. This is very important. So it may ultimately be more akin to those of a severe seasonal influenza, which has a case fatality rate of approximately 0.1%, or a pandemic influenza, similar to those in 1957 and 1968 when we did not lock down the nation, rather than a disease similar to SARS or MERS, which is what we were panicked about, which have had case fatality rates of 9 to 10% and 36% respectively. Now remember, SARS, none of these things ended up being anything. They didn't transmit that far, but we didn't lock the country down, which begs the question, why are we locked down now? Isn't that the question we've all been needing to ask? Several weeks ago, I said we all need to demand to know what percentage rate is it? What death rate warrants a quarantine so that we know if we're below that death rate that we can open things back up. Now remember, he's not saying total deaths. This is literally the death rate looks like it may be on track for a seasonal flu. CNN actually reported an article that came out in The Lancet that said something similar, a little bit higher number, but again, everybody is running to backtrack their numbers right now. Coronavirus death rate is lower than previously reported, study says, but it's still deadlier than seasonal flu. Here's the numbers it predicts. Well, this was another article. Here's the actual Lancet article. Data from the epicenter of the outbreak in Wuhan have primarily been obtained through hospital surveillance and thus are likely to represent patients with moderate or severe illness, with atypical pneumonia or acute respiratory distress being used to define suspected cases eligible for testing. In these individuals, clinical outcomes are likely to be more severe, so any estimates of the case fatality ratio will be higher. So they go on to say our estimated overall infection fatality ratio for China was 0.66%, with an increasing profile with age. Similarly, estimates of the proportion of infected individuals likely to be hospitalized increased with age up to a maximum of 18.4% in those aged 90 years or older. 0.66%. Those are the percentage rates. Now, by the way, how they come up with those numbers, if you read the article, essentially they took expatriated people from China that were getting off of airplanes, and they looked at how many, they tested all of them and saw how many were asymptomatic, how many had symptoms, and then by that they determined, I believe the number that there was about, they were off between around 19 to 1, some estimate as high as 40 to 1, but it's those sort of exit polls being done with testing off of airplanes that came to the conclusion it could be more like 0.6%. Well, that's under 1%. And this is why I've been asking for the number. Had we known the number, had Fauci said anything under 1%, we believe we don't really have. It's going to be a bad flu season, but we should probably not destroy our economy any further. We're at 0.6%, but again, because no one in news has ever asked that important question, we don't know where we're at. I ask you, is a 0.6% death rate worthy of locking down the world? And remember, that's high. Fauci said it could be as low as the seasonal flu. I remember when Donald Trump, who we make a lot of fun of for not understanding this, he predicted this would be less than 1%. This is what he said in the Rose Garden 2 weeks ago.
I think we're substantially under 1% because the people that get better are not reporting. So we only know people that go to doctors and go to hospitals, and we're taking that, and we're still a little bit above 1%.
You know how much ridicule he got? He was attacked by mainstream news agencies, you know, daring to say that this was trivial or was under 1%. Now, what I want to get to now is the numbers. What are the numbers? We have Deborah Birx now really saying we are trying to model this. And Fauci at one point said, you know, a model is only as good as what you put into it. And you got to hand it to Dr. Fauci. I mean, I just want to point this out. This guy has made a million different predictions now. Everywhere from millions could die, hundreds of thousands could die, all the way down that this could just be a seasonal flu. It gives you some sense of why he has probably held on to that position as the head of NIAID for as long as he has, because obviously if you make a prediction for every single possible outcome there could be, when it's all over and people want to come after you and be upset with you, then you can say, no, I made that prediction too. Now, let me be perfectly clear, because this is something we weren't going to cover, but there have been, my understanding is that Fauci's guards or whatever has been ramped up because there are people that are making death threats and things like that. I think that's a horrifying outcome. And I think it's really not, should not be called for. We should never be attacking people. These are scientists doing the best job they can. He's covering his bases. He's doing what he can. We have got to be civil. We've got to be rational. That's the only way we get through this. And that's what we're trying to do here in the High Wire. We're trying to be rational. I'm not trying to get anyone in trouble. The president and Fauci and Deborah Birx and even, you know, Neil Ferguson are doing the best they can. Are they most talented at it? Are they looking in the right places? Only time will tell and history will tell. But what we're trying to do here on the High Wire is show you where these numbers must be coming from and where we think you should be looking. And I think we have one of the best scientific investigative teams in the world, because as you've watched throughout the weeks, more and more, all of the science is marching. They're downgrading the numbers to where the High Wire has been from the beginning. So now let's talk about this estimation. They're now saying it could be between 100,000 deaths and 200,000 deaths. You heard Deborah Birx say if we do everything right, it would be between 100,000 and 200,000 deaths, you know, respectively. Now, if we do everything right, I don't think, as I said at the top of the show, that chloroquine or any of the drugs that are in testing right now, are being tested right now, have anything to do with this. But remember, when you say 100 to 200,000 deaths, and you're saying that the peak is coming in the next 2 weeks, that brings some serious questions. And luckily for us, someone asked one of those questions at one of these podium statements. Here's Deborah Birx asking answering a very important question.
So right now we're at about 4,000 deaths here in the United States. You're suggesting a spike of more than 90,000 deaths over the next few weeks. Do you have a demographic breakdown of the areas that are most at risk and where most of those deaths may occur?
Well, right now, and I think if you ask Chris Murray, he would say he's using the information coming out of New York and New Jersey and applying that to potentially other states having the same outcomes. I just want to say again, this yellow line, and this is all corrected for 100,000 residents. So this is normalized so we can compare apples to apples. This is still Washington State, this yellow. So they've been able to, for a long time of measuring cases, not have a spike. So it's possible, and we're watching very closely to make sure it doesn't have a spike. But that's what the people in Washington State are doing. This is what every community, Washington State early, about 2 weeks before New York or New Jersey. California, a week before New York or New Jersey. Really talked to their communities and decided to mitigate before they started seeing this number of cases. And now we know that that makes a big difference. Early, as Dr. Fauci said, if you wait till you see it, it's too late.
And again, do you have a demographic breakdown, Dr. Birx, of where these deaths may occur?
So there's a demographic breakdown that we've discussed before related to mortality. And it's as we're seeing in New York exactly what we saw in Italy. Very low mortality, not to say that young people under 30 or young people under 40 aren't getting ill. They are, but most of them are recovering. So the profile looks identical to Italy, with increasing mortality with age and pre-existing medical conditions. And so that is holding in the same way.
Remember, and I do not want you to forget this now for the rest of this show, Deborah Birx just said the profile is matching Italy identically. That we are going on the same path. We're watching exactly what we saw in Italy. That's why I showed you the Italy numbers again. Now remember, just to burn it in, this is what we know about Italy, that 99% of the cases had comorbid issues, things that they were likely going to die of anyway, and they just happened to be dying with COVID-19, not from COVID-19. And they're downgraded as they look at the numbers. They say, we've got to really just say that it's about 12%, that 88% of the cases appeared to really just be dying from those comorbid issues. This is massive. It's important. Remember that 99% number. Remember, Deborah said we're matching them identically. Well, that's exactly what the CDC just put out. This is the CDC's preliminary estimates of the prevalence of selected underlying health conditions among patients with coronavirus disease. Okay? This is their conclusion. Among all COVID-19 patients with complete information on underlying condition or risk factors, 184 deaths occurred, 173 deaths of those above the age of 19. 94% were reported among patients with at least one underlying condition, almost identical to what they were saying in Italy. In Italy, it was 99% of cases. The CDC's own look at this is saying 94% of the cases seem to have a comorbid effect. This was discussed in a piece on BBC News that went on to say coronavirus deaths, what we don't know. And in this article, do we have the article? He goes on to say the coronavirus deaths will not be in addition to these, as statistician Professor Sir David Spiegelhalter, an expert in public understanding of risk at the University of Cambridge, explains. Look at this. There will be substantial overlap in these two groups. Many people who die of COVID, the disease caused by coronavirus, would have died anyway within a short period of time. This is exactly why Bhakti was setting off an alarm and sending a letter to Merkel. Very quickly, let's just look at his last line of his discussion in his letter. He said, we know there's a problem. My question, has Germany simply followed this trend of a COVID-19 general suspicion? And is it intended to continue this categorization uncritically as in other countries? How then is a distinction to be made between genuine corona-related deaths and accidental virus presence at the time of death? Remember, the question is, yes, you may have coronavirus. And by the way, if you're in a hospital for your heart condition or anything else, and COVID-19 is running rampant now in those hospitals because that's why people are showing up, odds are if you didn't have it, you could catch it. This is a known factor when fighting any sort of illness like this. But despite the fact, we have a sense that whether or not you have COVID, you're not dying from it, as we know from Italy. And Birx is saying we are seeing the exact same trend here. This is very, very important because just this morning we saw the New York numbers. Now, this is from the 28th, a few days ago. They showed us an entire chart, a sheet on the numbers. I want to show you something because it explains exactly what's going on here. Take a look at this. This is the daily data summary from, this is yesterday's now, April 1st, okay? The data in this report reflect events and activities as of April 1st, 2020 at 4:30 p.m. All data in this report are preliminary and subject to change as case continued to be investigated. These data include cases in New York City residents and foreign residents treated in New York City facilities. First of all, look how detailed it is. We have the age groups, 0 to 17, very low rate of infections. 18 to 44, 45 to 64, 65 to 74, 75 and over. You see exactly what they're saying. Older people are dealing with this. But look at the underlying conditions. How many of these people, once you're at 45 years and older, up to 64, you know, all of these people have underlying conditions. Look how few have don't have underlying conditions that are, these are the deaths, remember, 0, 4, 9, 1, single-digit numbers compared to mid-hundreds, meaning basically exactly what we were seeing in Italy. The people that are dying with underlying conditions. This is a major, major concern that Bhakti is pointing out. How can we know what the actual death rate of COVID-19 is if we are not going to be very, very particular about separating those who had pre-existing conditions? Well, we went to our own websites to try and understand what significance pre-existing conditions have. Now, again, I'm going to try and show you. For those of you that are watching this show and maybe you're getting bored, this is way too many details, then this show isn't for you. We are all about the details. We geek out on the details because it's all about the details. Our lives are hanging in the balance. Whether or not we have jobs in the future and what happens on this planet is all about details. So we tried to find the numbers. We tried to find the significant numbers. How many people died? What was the death rate like we have at Euromomo? Well, when you go to the CDC's website, they are not as good at it. Unfortunately, when we typed it in, this is what we had to do. We went to https://wonder.cdc.gov. We went to detailed mortality, okay? You can do this too. You have to agree to their terms. Now, we want to do a search, right? So what we searched for was the 15 leading causes of death. And then we want to do it for the most recent year. I wish we could have done 2019 or 2020, but 2018 is all that's been updated, so we selected 2018. And here it is. Here are the top causes of death 2 years ago in America. These would be your comorbid conditions. Now look at that. At the top of the list, as we all know, is diseases of the heart. 655,000 people in America died in 2018 from heart conditions. Certainly heart conditions would be a pre-existing condition. We also know that those people that are on ACE inhibitors are at higher risk, it appears. There's studies coming out and people investigating because ACE2 is where coronavirus rides. I'm not going to get deep into details, but you could be at heightened risk. But what if you have coronavirus and a heart disease and you're in the hospital? If you die, are they going to list it as a COVID-19 death? Now look just 4 rows down. This is an extremely significant number. Chronic lower respiratory disease. These are all the respiratory diseases that are basically below your neck, meaning your lungs, so asthma and COPD. In 2018, 159,486 people died of lower respiratory disease. Now let's go down 2 more places to diabetes, because we're hearing that a lot of people that are dying in this death rate are those that are severely overweight, older, and suffering from diabetes. Well, diabetes kills nearly 85,000 people a year. And then you can, what else do we have? We have flu down there, right? Can I find it? Where is it? Right below diabetes. Oh, there it is. Influenza. I'm looking for flu. It's called influenza, Del. Influenza and pneumonia. There we go. 59,000 people. So just think of those categories. These are all people that will easily have comorbidities with coronavirus. 59,000 for the flu, 85,000. So it was roughly 140,000 now if you add in diabetes. Then we go to chronic lower respiratory, another 160,000. So there were 300,000 potential comorbidities. And then you go to heart disease, 655. You're at nearly 1 million people that are going to die, just as it was said in that piece from the UK, that are going to die anyway this year. What happens to your numbers if COVID-19 is in there? Now, certainly you would want to be really defining the difference so that you don't list people that were going to be dying of heart disease, right? So that we don't bolster these numbers. Because we're saying 100,000 to 200,000 are going to die in America if we do everything right. Now I want you to think about this, that if those are the numbers, that those are the comorbidities, then we're looking at exactly what they're talking about, right? So how are we listing the deaths? How is this getting listed? I'm hoping, just as Bhakti is in Germany, we're all hoping America's going to be really, really tight about this, right? We're really going to nail it down. Well, I want to go back to something we just touched on last week, and that was the CDC advisement talking about how to categorize a death for COVID-19. This is the guidance for certifying COVID-19 deaths. And what it goes on to say, it is important to emphasize that coronavirus disease 2019 or COVID-19 should be reported on the death certificate for all decedents where the disease caused or is assumed to have caused or contributed to the death. So they literally tell them right there, go ahead, and even if you're assuming, if the test didn't come in and you have to assume. Now, it goes even deeper because we didn't really look closely at the death certificate itself. And I want to look at that because it tells you how to fill this out. This is very important. Remember, we want to be selecting out whether you died of heart disease or a lower respiratory illness you already had, right? Here's how it tells you to fill it out. Can we bring up the death certificate? If the decedent had other chronic conditions, such as COPD or asthma, which would have been the 159,000 people that died in 2018 or virtually every year, that may have also contributed, these conditions can be reported in Part 2. In Part 2, what does that mean? Part 1 and Part 2. Well, here we look at the death certificate. In Part 1, you will see that's the top section here, and they tell you how to fill it out. So this patient, I'm imagining is an imaginary patient, had an acute respiratory distress syndrome for the last 2 days, so obviously they were going into a major problem. They also had pneumonia for 10 days, and they were diagnosed with having had COVID-19 or assumed to have had COVID-19, which is what they tell you, right? So put that in the top group, and what you're going to list this as is a COVID-19 death. Now, if they were suffering from something else like a heart disease or COPD, which they told you with an acute respiratory illness, put that in Part 2. Part 2, the less significant part of this document, meaning it very well will read not COPD killed you or some other lower respiratory illness you were suffering from, but we will list it as coronavirus. You may think that I'm pushing this, but this is the actual document that was sent out. And they really doubled down. Last week, we were just showing you what they were recommending, but they actually came out with an exact coding now. The coding. Now in every hospital, here it is, saying we have a code for COVID-19. This is the article. The new ICD code introduced for COVID-19. This was March 24th. Remember, March 24th is right about the time you start seeing the COVID deaths exploding. Right there. Look at March 24th. It's right at the beginning. Did the deaths explode, or did we have a backlog that couldn't code it, is number one question. Once we start coding, this thing blows up through the roof. And the letter goes on to say to everybody, make sure you give this new code to everybody that was collecting it. What happens, all right, and here's what it goes on to say. For those questioning, how do you use this new code, right? What happens if the terms reported on death certificate indicate uncertainty? If we have a question, look what it says. If the death certificate reports terms such as probable COVID-19 or likely COVID-19, these terms would be assigned the new ICD-9 code, meaning it doesn't matter if you were guessing at it. Doesn't matter if you just thought maybe it was COVID-19. Put in the ICD-9 code. And in case you're worried about backlash, look at this sentence. It is not likely that NCHS will follow up on these cases. What? It's almost like they're saying, you know, go ahead and call it COVID-19. We're trying to bump these numbers up a little bit. And don't worry, it is coming from us. Obviously, we can't say that. But what we're saying to you is, even if you think it's likely, even if you don't have a background, you don't have a test to prove it, and there's uncertainty, just put the code in there and don't worry about it, okay? Don't worry about it. We'll take it from there, and you will never get called out on this. If you think that that's not enough, they double down on this. They say it over and over again in this paper. In fact, I think it's best exemplified by how they try to emphasize what they want you to know. When you look at this entire letter, there are literally only 2 sentences that have been bolded in the entire letter. The top, new ICD-9 code introduced for COVID-19 deaths. Go all the way down, and there at the bottom, we want you to know, assumed to have caused or contributed to death. Use the code even if you're just assuming it's a COVID-19 death. You cannot make this stuff up, folks. These are the real facts. These are the real documents. And so now I want to talk about human nature. I want to discuss, what is this going to do to our numbers? Because if, as we're hearing a great question, are you saying there's going to be 90,000 deaths in the next week? Is that really what we're going to see? And by the way, it's not just mainstream media that's reporting this incredible rise. There are very dramatic predictions by people in social media, some even in the natural health movement that are saying body bags are piling up. Thousands and thousands of people are going to be dying. But that's always been true. Thousands and thousands of people are always dying in America. 655,000, in fact, from heart disease. 160,000 from respiratory issues. 90,000 from diabetes. We went through it. Those are all deaths that are happening right now as we speak. So at any given moment, you could say, look at the bodies piling up, right? But what does this mean for us? Let's go back and look at this chart one more time in New York. Can we bring up the chart that we got out of New York, just so it reminds people that, remember, if you're a doctor now and you're in one of these hospitals, 0, 4, 9, 1, 4, those are the people that actually only have and are dying of COVID-19. Those are the ones you would have been sure to put on the certificate. But all those, the 75 and over, with 431 underlying conditions, 257 underlying conditions, this document is telling you, go ahead and list them too. And why would that be important? Imagine what's going on. If you were watching the news, you know that there's some argument that there's a lot of fighting going on between governors that are all bidding on the same respiratory equipment and masks and things like that. Funding's going out to all these different hospitals. And even Donald Trump is saying, look, yeah, he's being blamed. You're holding on to the respiratory equipment. He says, you're right, I am, because I need to see where the crisis is happening. We can't send a bunch of, respirators and materials over to someone that doesn't have a crisis when it ends up being over here, and then how do we get it back? It makes perfect sense. But now imagine you're a governor of the state of Texas or the state of Michigan or somewhere else. You don't want to be the state that didn't have enough equipment if this virus ends up being what Neil Ferguson had, exaggerated it to be. You don't want to be the one holding back. And by the way, if you're the head of a hospital, do you want to be the one that came up short on respirators or on drugs or on chloroquine or any of these things? No, you do not. So when the President of the United States and the CDC is telling you, look, we're going to give the equipment to those in need, those in crisis, what do? You tell your staff, we need to show a crisis. Whether or not it's happening now, we don't want to be left naked, all by ourselves, unable to protect ourselves. So go ahead and do what the CDC just told you you can do. List everybody that has died with COVID-19, even when you know it's not from COVID-19. Tell me that's not happening. Tell me I'm exaggerating that. You know, in whatever business you are, if the authorities, if the FCC or anyone gave you the ability to go ahead and ramp up the crisis as much as you want and say, we're never going to investigate your numbers, we're just going to send you whatever materials you need if you look like you're in crisis, then I think the odds are that we are going to be in even worse diagnostic numbers and understanding than Italy. Because CDC just went out of its way to bolster the COVID-19 numbers. I don't know why. I don't know what's behind it. And I guarantee you in the weeks to come, we're going to start trying to investigate what would be the motivations when we are in the middle of a crisis. And it seems that if people really cared about the United States of America and our future, and whether or not we have an economy and an ability to protect ourselves, we would want to know if this has just been over-exaggerated as soon as we can find out. Because remember, all they keep saying is, we just don't have the data. We just don't know the numbers. It's really hard to tell how many were asymptomatic carriers. We know that in Italy, it's really hard to tell how many actually died of the disease or had comorbid issues. But you went out of your way to bolster the COVID numbers in a way we have never done that before. And so then in the end, don't you have to question the numbers that you're looking at right now? The thousands of deaths as we speak in New York and around the world, don't we have to question it? Don't we have to start attributing at least the mathematical principle coming out of Italy? Because if, in the worst case scenario, Dr. Andrew Fauci and Deborah Birx are saying it could be as high as 250,000 deaths. I just showed you how easily we can get to that number. But if you multiplied 250,000 potential deaths by the 12% that they're using in Italy, and I'm guessing they're going to do a similar thing in Germany, that means your 250,000 deaths really from COVID-19 was probably more like 30,000 deaths. Well, within inside of a flu outbreak, just as, we heard from Dr. Fauci. There it is. The deaths acceptable by the CDC every year between 12 and 61,000. If we were to do the math as it's done it in Italy, we are right in the middle of that. It's true, Dr. Fauci, this does look like a very serious or somewhat serious flu. No doubt people are dying, and some of coronavirus. But we're really going to have to question these numbers now. And remember, as the numbers keep coming down, and Neil Ferguson brings down his numbers, he has, of course, started defending himself and saying, what I meant was it's 20,000 now that we're in lockdown. Folks, UK was in lockdown for 1 day before Ferguson dropped it from 500,000 to 20,000. We have no idea if lockdown is working at all. And I want to advise you that the former, creator, one of the creators of the Cochrane collaboration, Dr. Peter Gutcha, put his name on the line that we presented last week. I mean, this guy has more, credits than you know what to do with. He says, should it turn out that the epidemic wanes before long, there will be a queue of people wanting to take credit for this. And we can be damn sure draconian measures like quarantine will be applied again next time. But remember the joke about tigers. Why do you blow the horn? To keep the tigers away. But there are no tigers here. There, you see, it worked. Folks, Fauci and Birx, maybe even Donald Trump, and all the people around the world that went out of their way to destroy our economy are going to try and tell you it was because we had lockdowns. But everything in the math and a growing body of international scientists are telling you otherwise. They're saying, be careful, it was never in the numbers. The real numbers never showed this. And even though Bill Gates wants to lock you down for another 6 to 10 weeks, he has no real numbers to defend it. Are they going to try and bolster it? Probably. But the big question will be when the numbers do come in, and if we do apply an equation like it's only 12% when we really look at it, and we come in at 30,000, how many people will say that the lockdown was what did it? Really? How effective was that lockdown when Prince Charles ended up getting COVID-19? When the Prime Minister of England ended up getting COVID-19? And here in America, the same. In fact, even our very own CNN's Chris Cuomo, somebody who went out of his way to say we all need to make this sacrifice. We all need to lock ourselves down. There it is, CNN host Chris Cuomo, brother of New York Governor Andrew Cuomo, has coronavirus. In fact, it seems like even with lockdown, this thing has been spreading like wildfire. Well after the lockdown, we watch it still, just at its peak in Italy. We've been locked down in New York. It's still peaking. Is it possible that everyone's just going to get this illness anyway? Would I be exaggerating if that was true? Look at what it says on the CDC's own website. The CDC expects that widespread transmission of COVID-19 in the United States will occur. In the coming months, most, not some, most of the U.S. population will be exposed to this virus. So will we be able to say that the quarantine worked? Or will we have to accept that we all actually just had coronavirus? We have herd immunity, so we never have to worry about it again. Sorry for being really dramatic about it, just like we were back with H1N1. Chris Cuomo is still continuing to be a little bit dramatic about it. Lucky for him, he can still make his salary by going out live from his basement while the rest of us are out of work. Take a look. This was his report from the basement of his own house.
I am Chris Cuomo, and welcome to Primetime. Tonight's show is going to be a little different, but the priority remains. Reality has set in all the way to the president. Brace yourselves, not for a hoax, but for the next few weeks of scary and painful realities. The government is saying we need to keep doing what we're doing. The data shows our mitigation efforts are working. The reality, we are our best and perhaps only defense. If you need a death toll, you will get it every day, and it will frighten you. 4,000 already, maybe 100,000, 250,000. Trumped up today by this president, potentially saying it could have been millions. My suggestion, don't get caught in the numbers. Why? They're just scary and they're out of context. We do not have the testing data to make real sense of our reality beyond what we know is the face of it for an overwhelming number who get sick. And that face is mine. I tested positive. Scary. Yes, as you might imagine, but better me than you. My concern is what I may have put on my family, just like you would. That is hurting me way more than anything a virus can.
All right, well, there you have Chris Cuomo. I think there's a few things I want to point out here. First of all, I have nothing against Chris Cuomo going live. And actually, he said, I think it was like a week ago, I hope I get it so I can report and take people through the process. So careful what you wish for. There it is, Chris. Also, he says we are being told the mitigation efforts are working on everybody except me, I guess, which is really shocking. But I want to point out something because there's a little bit difference on how the news is being reported and how we're doing. If you didn't notice that Chris Cuomo is not looking at the camera, you're probably thinking to yourself, isn't he aware that while he's talking to the computer, he has to look at the camera? Well, he is aware because at the end of it, he looks you right in the eyes. See, what he's doing there is he's reading either some form of a teleprompter or he's got cards up there because that's how he's used to reporting it to you. And I don't point this out to make fun of him. This is how the news is done. I suppose I wish we could afford a teleprompter. I don't have one in front of me. I've got this little camera sitting here, and we're winging it the whole way. I'm telling you what I actually think. And I'm telling it because I did the investigations with my team. I sat down with my team to totally understand the science so that I could just sit here without a commercial and try and make sense of it to you the entire time. I'm not bragging. I'm just saying it's a very different approach. Chris Cuomo is reading something, that entire opening statement. It seems like he could have made that statement on his own, but he doesn't. Other people write for him. I want to point out something else, that I think also exemplifies a problem with how we're getting our news and who's getting our news. Don Lemon, who obviously is very close with Chris Cuomo, had a very difficult time, presenting his information after Chris Cuomo. This is Don Lemon trying to get through his own broadcast with the idea that his friend Chris Cuomo sounds to have something like a nasal congestion in the basement of his house. This is how Don Lemon handled it.
Hospitals, I'm sorry, that was the next thing. Sorry, I told you I was distracted. Vianna, sorry about that. Thank you, Vianna.
Can I just tell you, by the way, we're all, I mean, for you being on air, and I know, this is one of those situations where you try to be stoic and focus on the headlines. It's tough. It's tough. So, I also feel for Chris, and I know it's tough for you, and we're all fighting and rooting for him tonight.
Well, sorry. I said I wasn't going to do this. Jesus. He's probably sitting at home laughing at me. So here's the thing.
No.
I have to, when I walk into work every day, and Chris and I are really good friends. We live near each other. And so when I walk into work every day, I have to walk by where Chris is. So I usually go to his office and I say, and what's doing. Sometimes I bring the dogs and we just say hello. Anyway, he's just not here. And we have this great relationship.
I've known Chris. Chris and I go back to when he and I both worked at ABC. He was one of the first people to congratulate me when I was pregnant, telling me that meant I was healthy. Speaking of healthy, I don't know anybody else who is healthier than Chris. And so it was good to see his face on television tonight. And, it's just a reminder that this impacts everyone and anyone, and it doesn't discriminate.
Okay, I'm not showing Don Lemon to make fun of the fact that he's crying about his friend Chris in this issue. In fact, it really alerted me to something and changed my mind a little bit. I mean, those of you who've seen, I've had some emotional moments on this show, and I am open to news reporters showing their feelings. But what I found shocking was the fact that Don Lemon somehow, over the last several weeks of reporting by virtually every scientific professional in the world, including, Fauci and Dr. Birx and others, have all said, if you're under the age of 65 and you're relatively healthy, as was being described in that report, you're really going to have almost no symptoms, or it'll be like a mild cold. And to see Don Lemon, in tears, telling a story. I mean, he clearly has a close relationship with Chris, but he's talking about walking dogs as though somehow it's going to be in the past tense. You would think that Chris Cuomo has got, 4th-stage cancer and is in his basement. I mean, I'm not making fun of this, and I'll be honest with you, when we've talked about fake news, the manipulation, and trying to scare people, it is clear to me that Don Lemon actually believes this. He has read so much from his teleprompter designed to scare you that he has scared the crap out of himself. And I think that's kind of sad. It is clear Chris Cuomo is really in no risk category whatsoever. So why are you crying, Don? You're crying, and it should alert all of us, because you represent the news. You are who we're listening to. And it is clear that you are obviously so in the dark because of the effort to instill fear by whoever's writing your copy, that it never came clear to you that for 90% or more of us, this is a common cold. Chris is not going to die, Don. You only believe that because you're in the dark. And what's dangerous is you're reporting from the dark, and you're keeping people in the dark. See, that's the difference between CNN, MSNBC, and every other major network in the high wire. We are not trying to scare you of the dark. We are turning the light on. And that light is simply mathematical equations, real data, real human beings, a real ability to understand this. Obviously, Chris and Don don't do their own math like we do here. And that's probably why I am not scared of COVID-19. I have no concern of COVID-19. Even if the numbers do pile up and end up going to 250,000, I showed you that the odds are that's just going to really be 30,000 if you apply the correct math, which is well within side of the flu, which Tony Fauci is already covering his butt to be able to tell you he predicted. This is great news, isn't it? You don't need to be afraid, America. You don't need to be afraid in this world. You simply have to say, I'm capable of that math. I'm capable of understanding it. And what I need to understand now is how much longer am I going to have to be out of a job? And that leads to me to the only concern I really have. One of the major concerns I have, we discussed last week. No one wants to talk about the death toll that happens when you quarantine people. For every 1%, we heard from Toby Rogers, the economist, for every 1%, there's a rise in unemployment. 58,000 people. The mortality rate rises by 58,000 people. It's being projected, we now know our unemployment rates are at 6.6 million. It's being projected we're probably at 20%, moving towards 30% unemployment. The catastrophe that could become for the health of this nation is really, really concerning. But there was something that was of even greater concern for me this week. It's somewhat hypothetical, but I want to share it with you because it helps us, I believe, get some perspective. I saw this headline, in fact, several like them in the news. COVID-19, China's industries resume production as government officials ease restrictions. Nearly all of China's major industrial companies have reportedly assumed production. Chinese officials put the number at over 95% of large enterprises, including the hard-hit province of Hubei, after much of the country's economy shut down to contain the COVID-19 virus. Another article goes on to say, in the face of lockdown, China's e-commerce giants deliver. This is Harvard Business Review. And Fortune, this headline, Apple's iPhone maker expects its China plants to be operating normally within weeks. Now, we have not been able to confirm if this ramping up of production is actually happening in China. As all things, it's very hard to understand what's going on in China. But it brings up, I think, perhaps one of the biggest risks there is. Because we talk about making this sacrifice here in America, sacrificing to stay home and watch Netflix, to just stay out of the way so doctors can do their jobs, right? Go ahead and accept the 6.6 million now unemployed and climbing. That's our duty. That's what we're supposed to take on. But what if China is going back into production? Is this really just about an illness anymore? What numbers should we be looking at? Because if the greatest industrial power in the world, with 1.5 million workers, ramps up and goes back into production over the next week or so, and starts producing all of the things that the rest of the world needs while we are hiding in our caves and in our houses, doing what we were told was right, watching our jobs disappear, then we are going to be getting all of our respiratory equipment from China, are we not? We're going to be getting our masks from China. We're going to be getting our drugs from China. And if we want a better television for what, we're watching our Netflix on at home, that will probably come from China. You see, we are always in a form of an economic war in this world. We are always looking at Russia, and we are looking at China. And we think of the fact that if an industrial complex like that ramped up while we weren't involved, folks, China could potentially take over the world. I don't think that's an exaggeration, and we'll have to look at it. But China already was what we were trying to temper ourselves with. Donald Trump was bringing sanctions, trying to get a better playing field, a more fair playing field. Well, now, there's no fairness if the entire race, every single car on the track and everyone in the world has pit stopped, and only one car is out there running around the track, and that's China going for the win. I think that that would be one of the worst case scenarios the world has ever seen. Do we want to be that indebted to China? Do we want them to own everything? Do we want them to sell everything? You see, when I think about that, it makes me look at these numbers in a different way. Sure, potentially 250,000 people might die in America. It sounds like a large number, but, I showed you 1 million will die with a very, comorbid conditions that we see with COVID-19. But those are very, very sick people that is being reported probably would have died anyway. Imagine if this was a literal war, a physical war, and China was rushing our borders with boats and planes and bombs, all in an effort to destroy our economy, to take over our jobs, to buy up our real estate, and essentially enslave the population of America so that we do China's bidding. And that all the other nations, those of you that watch this show in Australia and UK, who also are not producing anything right now, as China may be ramping up, I want to ask you this very sobering question. How many people, how many lives would we be willing to risk to fight China off, to fight a physical battle? I assure you that number is much higher than 250,000 soldiers that we would rush in to protect the greatness of this nation and the future for our children and an economy that just a few weeks ago was exploding. We would put millions forward if that's what it took. But those millions would not be our sickest who are going to die anyway. It would be the strongest and healthiest men and women this country has to offer. So as we move forward, as we try to wrap around our head around really the true numbers that are clearly going to be bloated, are we going to be more at 30,000 when the numbers are done? And while we were waiting for those numbers, did we lose control of the world? Did we lose control of our jobs? Did we become enslaved to a power that didn't care what the death rate was, but marched its people forward to produce while we hid in our homes? These are hard decisions to make. I think there's a lot positive. Hopefully in the next 2 weeks, we see what's going on, and we understand how bad this was going to be. But there is a crisis. And it's not just those who are sick and we're going to die anyway. It's our future hanging in the balance. You may think you could make this decision easily. You may want to make fun of Donald Trump. I assure you, these are all of the issues on his plate, and I guarantee you he's watching China. But it makes this conversation very different, extremely important. And what we're trying to do on the High Wire is turn on the light so you can read it for yourself and understand why your nation may open up its borders again and send us back to work. If that's the case, I hope you will be confident that America will prevail. This is the High Wire, bringing you the truth as we find it. Please donate, become a recurring donor so that you can see all of this information yourself. I look forward to continuing this investigation. We're all in this together, and I'll join you all next week on the High Wire. Thanks for watching, and thank you for being a High Wire insider. Be sure to share this show with your friends on Facebook, YouTube, Periscope, and Instagram. Because knowledge is power, power is freedom, and we need all we can get.